The world in Year 1 AD was a completely different system compared to any modern understanding of civilization. There were no nations connected under one global structure, no modern communication systems, and no shared economic or political order. Instead, the world existed as separate regions, each governed by its own empire, kingdom, or tribal system. Human civilization at this time was still in a developmental phase. Large parts of the world were organized into powerful empires, while many other regions were still operating under local rulers or tribal leadership. There was no concept of a unified global population or international governance. One of the most dominant political powers in the Western world was the Roman Empire. At this time, Rome controlled vast territories covering large parts of Europe, North Africa, and regions of the Middle East. The Roman Empire functioned under a centralized authority system led by emperors and supported by a highly structured administrative and military organization. Roman governance was based on law, discipline, and expansion. Their military system was highly trained and organized into legions. These legions allowed Rome to maintain control over distant provinces and expand its influence across large geographical areas. Roads constructed by the Romans connected cities and military outposts, enabling faster movement of armies and goods compared to many other civilizations of the time. Roman engineering was also advanced for its era. They developed large-scale infrastructure systems including roads, bridges, and aqueducts. Aqueducts were used to transport water into cities, supporting urban populations and public facilities. These systems played an important role in sustaining Roman cities and military centers. In the eastern part of the world, China was under the rule of the Han Dynasty. The Han Empire was one of the most organized civilizations of its time, with a strong bureaucratic system. Government officials were selected through administrative systems, and written records were highly valued for managing state affairs. Chinese society during this period placed strong emphasis on agriculture, education, and trade. One of the most significant developments associated with this civilization was the early use of paper-like materials and advanced textile production, such as silk. These goods became highly valuable in long-distance trade networks. Between these major civilizations, South Asia consisted of multiple kingdoms and regional powers. There was no single unified empire controlling the entire region at that exact moment. Instead, different rulers governed different territories, and societies were primarily based on agricultural systems. Agriculture was the foundation of almost all civilizations during this period. The majority of the global population worked in farming or related activities. Crop production determined economic stability, and societies depended heavily on seasonal cycles and environmental conditions. There were no industrial systems, and food production was entirely manual. Common crops included grains such as wheat, barley, and rice, depending on the region. Farming techniques varied between civilizations, but the overall dependence on land and weather conditions remained consistent across the world. Outside of agricultural communities, small groups of people worked as craftsmen, traders, soldiers, and administrators. Trade existed between regions but was limited by distance and transportation speed. Goods were transported using animals, carts, and sea routes. Long-distance trade networks, such as early forms of the Silk Road, connected parts of Asia with the Middle East and Europe, although travel was slow and indirect. Housing structures in Year 1 AD varied significantly based on region and social status. In major cities like Rome, stone buildings and structured urban planning were common. Public spaces such as forums, baths, and markets played important roles in daily urban life. However, in rural areas, most people lived in simple houses constructed from mud, wood, or basic stone materials. There was no electricity or mechanical lighting systems. Light sources were limited to fire, oil lamps, or candles. As a result, daily activity was largely dependent on natural daylight, and most work ended after sunset. Clothing materials were primarily natural fibers such as wool, linen, and cotton. Textile production was entirely manual, and clothing quality depended on social class and regional resources. Wealthier individuals had access to finer materials and more detailed designs, while the majority of the population wore basic functional clothing. Social structure during this period was highly hierarchical. Societies were generally divided into ruling elites, military groups, merchants, skilled workers, and farmers. The majority of the population belonged to lower economic classes, particularly those involved in agriculture and manual labor. Education was not widely accessible. Literacy rates were low across most regions, and formal education was generally limited to elite classes or administrative groups. Knowledge transfer mostly occurred through family traditions, apprenticeships, and oral instruction. Technology in Year 1 AD was based on mechanical tools, basic engineering, and manual systems. Roman engineering contributed significantly through infrastructure such as roads and water systems. Chinese civilization contributed administrative systems and early technological innovations in materials and agriculture. South Asian regions contributed agricultural techniques and trade-based systems. Despite the absence of modern machinery or scientific institutions, these civilizations developed foundational systems that supported long-term human development. At this stage in history, civilizations operated independently, with limited interaction and no global integration. Each region developed its own systems based on geography, resources, and cultural evolution. While large empires such as Rome and the Han Dynasty represented organized political systems, the majority of the world in Year 1 AD was still made up of local societies, tribal regions, and small kingdoms. Global governance did not exist, and there was no unified system connecting civilizations. Political power was entirely regional. Each empire or kingdom operated independently with its own laws, leadership structure, and military systems. There was no central authority controlling the world as a whole. Instead, influence was divided among multiple major powers. The Roman Empire in the West operated under imperial rule. Emperors held centralized authority supported by a structured Senate system and military administration. Roman control extended across vast territories, and maintaining this control required continuous military presence in provinces. Expansion and defense were key priorities of Roman governance. In the East, the Han Dynasty in China functioned as a highly organized bureaucratic state. Administrative roles were assigned based on civil systems, and record-keeping played a critical role in governance. Agriculture and taxation systems were carefully managed to support the population and maintain stability within the empire. In South Asia, political authority was divided among multiple regional kingdoms. There was no single centralized empire covering the entire subcontinent at that exact time. Local rulers controlled different territories, and governance systems varied depending on region and culture. Military conflicts during this period were primarily regional rather than global. Wars were fought between neighboring kingdoms, expanding empires, and tribal groups. The Roman Empire engaged in expansion campaigns and border defense operations. In China, military activity focused on internal stability and the protection of borders. In other regions, conflicts were often related to land control, resources, and local authority. There was no concept of global war, as civilizations were not interconnected enough to form worldwide alliances or conflicts. Warfare was limited to specific geographical regions and did not involve the entire known world. Technology during this period developed independently across civilizations. In the Roman Empire, engineering advancements included large-scale road networks, bridges, and aqueduct systems. These infrastructures supported transportation, military movement, and urban water supply systems. Roman roads were constructed with layered materials to improve durability, allowing faster movement of armies and trade goods. Aqueduct systems used gravity-based engineering to transport water into cities, supporting population growth in urban centers. In China, technological development focused on administrative systems, agriculture, and material production. Early forms of paper-like materials were being developed, which later became a major innovation in written communication. Silk production was also highly advanced and became one of the most valuable trade goods in international exchange networks. Agricultural tools in both Rome and China improved productivity compared to earlier periods, but farming still relied heavily on manual labor and natural conditions. In South Asia, technological development included advancements in metallurgy, textiles, and agricultural practices. Iron tools were widely used in farming and construction activities. Trade systems were also active, connecting different regions through land and sea routes. Transportation technology across all civilizations remained basic. Movement was primarily dependent on walking, animals such as horses and camels, and simple carts. Sea travel was used for long-distance trade, but navigation methods were limited compared to modern systems. Communication systems were also slow. Information traveled through messengers, travelers, and written documents carried physically between regions. There was no instant communication system, and information exchange between civilizations took long periods of time. Societies in Year 1 AD were structured in hierarchical systems. At the top were rulers, emperors, and governing elites. Below them were military forces and administrative officials. Merchants and traders formed an important middle layer, facilitating economic exchange between regions. The majority of the population consisted of farmers and laborers who provided the essential foundation for food production and economic stability. Education systems were limited and not widely accessible. Literacy was primarily concentrated among administrative classes, religious groups, and elite families. Most people learned skills through practical experience rather than formal educational institutions. Cultural and belief systems varied significantly across regions. Each civilization had its own traditions, religious practices, and philosophical systems. These belief structures influenced social behavior, governance, and daily life, although they remained localized rather than globally unified. By the end of Year 1 AD, the world remained divided into separate civilizations with independent systems of governance, economy, and technology. However, these civilizations collectively formed the foundation of future global development. Over time, gradual improvements in trade, communication, and technology would eventually connect these isolated systems. Year 1 AD represents an early stage of structured human civilization, where foundational political, technological, and social systems were established independently across different parts of the world. This concludes the structured overview of the world in Year 1 AD.